The Mafia boss was in the middle of a meeting with the most dangerous men in Seattle when he received an emergency call about a dying baby girl at his hospital and froze when he discovered she was his ex-lover's daughter. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you are watching from, and do not forget to rate this story from 0 to 10 when it ends. Now sit back and enjoy every detail. The crystal chandeliers of Russo Tower's penthouse cast sharp shadows across the mahogany conference table as Lorenzo Russo surveyed the room full of crime lords who had come to negotiate territory. At 36, his presence alone was enough to silence a room full of killers. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the storm brewing outside, lightning slashing through the Seattle skyline like a warning. Or maybe it was the anniversary approaching. Exactly 1 year since Scarlett walked out of his life without a word. Lorenzo's reflection caught in the floor-to-ceiling windows as he swirled his glass of whiskey, his fourth of the night. Tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his three-piece black Armani suit perfectly, he had the kind of presence that made even the most ruthless men avoid his gaze. His dark hair was always immaculately styled, even during the longest negotiations, framing steel-gray eyes that could read a man's lies before he finished speaking. A faded scar ran along his left cheekbone, a reminder of the night his father was assassinated when he was 16. The Patek Philippe watch on his wrist cost more than most people's houses. And his hands, those hands had ended more lives than anyone in this room could count. The Russo empire had just acquired another hospital chain worth $200 million, making headlines in business journals across the country. Everyone called him ruthless, untouchable, the king who had turned his father's crumbling organization into a legitimate dynasty. What they did not know was that he could not sleep at night, that every time he closed his eyes, he saw auburn hair and green eyes that haunted him like a ghost he could not exorcise. If you are enjoying this story, smash that like button and share it with someone who loves drama. Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell so you never miss another story. Now, let us find out what happens when the most dangerous man in Seattle discovers he has a daughter he never knew existed. The conference room door flew open, drawing every eye in the room toward it. Enzo Moretti stepped inside. The face of the 34-year-old man who was usually cold and composed, now stretched tight with tension, the veins along his neck standing out starkly. Lorenzo frowned slightly, because in 10 years as the right hand of Don Russo, Enzo had never dared to interrupt a meeting this important. Enzo leaned in and whispered into Lorenzo's ear, his voice hoarse, as if he were forcing himself to stay in control. "There's an emergency at Seattle General, sir. A 4-month-old baby girl is dying." Lorenzo didn't move. His steel-gray eyes remained fixed on the territorial map spread across the table. "Hospitals have hundreds of doctors," he replied coldly. "Why would they need me?" Enzo swallowed, hesitating for a second before continuing. "Because the baby's mother is named Scarlett Hayes." The whiskey glass in Lorenzo's hand slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor, the sound of breaking glass echoing through the suddenly silent room. The entire table froze. The most notorious crime bosses in Seattle collectively held their breath as they witnessed something they hadn't seen in 20 years. Lorenzo Russo lost control. The Mafia boss's face drained of color in an instant, his gray eyes widening as if someone had just driven a knife straight through his chest. That name, the name he had tried to bury through 365 sleepless nights, the name he had forbidden anyone in the organization to ever speak. Scarlett. "What did you say?" Lorenzo asked again, his voice trembling in a way he didn't even recognize. Enzo repeated each word slowly. "Scarlett Hayes. She ran into the emergency room 20 minutes ago carrying a baby girl. The child stopped breathing. The doctors are doing everything they can, but her condition is critical." Lorenzo shot to his feet, the expensive leather chair crashing backward with a loud thud. He didn't look at the men in the room, didn't explain, didn't apologize. He charged toward the door like a madman, leaving behind a room full of killers staring at one another in shock. "Get the car ready," Lorenzo snarled as he stepped into his private elevator. Enzo ran after him, already dialing the drivers. But one question kept drilling into Lorenzo's mind, stealing his breath. A 4-month-old baby. Scarlett left 1 year ago. 4 months plus 9 months of pregnancy made 13 months. That wasn't possible. Or maybe it was. Lorenzo leaned back against the elevator wall, hands that had taken lives without flinching now shaking uncontrollably. If that baby was his child, if Scarlett had been carrying his blood when she left, then for an entire year she had faced everything alone. And he, the most powerful boss in Seattle, hadn't known a thing. The elevator doors opened in the basement, and Lorenzo lunged into the black Maybach idling in wait. "Drive," he ordered, his voice sharp as a blade. "As fast as you can." The car roared into the storm, and Lorenzo Russo realized his hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. For the first time in 20 years, Since the night his father was assassinated right in front of him, the Mafia boss felt fear. Rain lashed against the car windows like thousands of tiny bullets. But Lorenzo heard nothing except the heavy pounding of his own heart inside his chest. The Maybach tore through the streets of Seattle at a reckless speed. Red lights and traffic signs rendered meaningless as Don Russo's convoy swept past. Enzo sat in the passenger seat, constantly calling for updates from the hospital. But Lorenzo didn't hear a single word. His mind had drifted back 18 months earlier, to the fateful night that changed his life forever. He met Scarlett in a dark alley in Capitol Hill. She was being cornered against a wall by 3 thugs, her bag of art supplies scattered across the ground. Yet there wasn't a trace of fear in her green eyes. She held a can of pepper spray aimed at them, her voice shaking but still sharp. One more step and you're blind. Lorenzo had planned to walk away, because things like that happened every night in Seattle, and they weren't his problem. But something in the young woman's gaze made him stop. Pride, stubborn defiance, like a small flame refusing to go out in the middle of a storm. He stepped out of the shadows, and with just one look from Lorenzo's steel-gray eyes, the 3 thugs fled without a trace. Scarlett didn't thank him. She simply looked him up and down and asked a question that made him laugh for the first time in years. Who are you that you look scarier than they do? That night, he drove her home to her small apartment on the outskirts of the city. She was an artist, making a living by sketching portraits for tourists at Pike Place Market and selling landscape paintings to cafes. She didn't know he was Lorenzo Russo. She only knew him as Lorenzo, a businessman, a mysterious man who appeared on late nights with tired eyes and a rare smile. 6 months. 6 months Lorenzo lived a different life beside Scarlett. He didn't tell her about the Russo Empire, about the Shadow Wars, about hands stained with blood. He was afraid that if she knew the truth, those eyes would look at him with disgust instead of warmth. Beside Scarlett, he wasn't a mafia boss. He was just a man, loved for who he truly was. They dated in secrecy. Lorenzo never took her to public places, never let his men know she existed. He told Scarlett he valued privacy, that his business attracted dangerous rivals. She believed him. She always believed him. And that was what made Lorenzo hate himself the most. Then, 1 year ago, Scarlett disappeared. No explanation. No farewell message. He went to her apartment only to find it empty. Unfinished paintings left behind like open wounds. He searched frantically, unleashing the entire underworld to scour Seattle. But Scarlett vanished as if the earth had swallowed her whole. He didn't understand. They hadn't fought. On their last night together, she had been in his arms, whispering that she loved him. So why? Why did she leave? Lorenzo asked himself that question thousands of times over 365 sleepless nights. He drank to forget. He killed to release his rage. He built a larger empire to fill the void. But nothing could erase the image of auburn hair and green eyes. The Maybach turned into the drive leading to Seattle General, hospital lights flickering through the rain. Lorenzo snapped out of his memories, reality crashing down like a blow to the chest. Scarlett was inside, and she had a 4-month-old daughter who was dying, a daughter who might very well carry Russo blood in her veins. Lorenzo stepped out of the car, rain soaking his expensive Armani suit, but he didn't care. He only knew he had to go inside. He had to see that baby. He had to know the truth. Even if the truth might destroy him completely. Lorenzo burst through the glass doors of Seattle General like a storm, rainwater dripping from his expensive suit onto the polished marble floor. The entire staff in the lobby froze when they realized who had just walked in. Don Russo, the man who owned this hospital chain, the man they only knew from business newspapers, the man whispered about as someone who could make anyone disappear with a single nod. Lorenzo didn't look at anyone. His gray eyes swept the lobby like a predator on the hunt. "Where's the emergency department?" he asked, his low voice echoing through the stunned silence. A young nurse trembled as she pointed down the left corridor, and Lorenzo was already moving before she could say another word. Enzo ran after him, struggling to keep up with his boss's long strides. The emergency ward lay at the end of the hallway, cold white fluorescent lights spilling over rows of glass rooms. Lorenzo stopped in front of emergency room number 3, and his heart felt as if it were being crushed by an invisible hand. Behind the glass, a tiny form lay on a gurney, surrounded by a web of medical machines beeping in steady rhythm. The baby was so small she nearly disappeared beneath the tubes and wires. Her skin was pale with a bluish cast like porcelain, her lips an alarming shade of purple, her tiny chest rising and falling so weakly it seemed it could stop at any moment. Dr. Nathan Cross stood beside the bed, his hands moving swiftly with the precision of a man who had performed these motions thousands of times. He was the finest surgeon money could buy, the man who had saved countless lives within the Russo organization over the past 10 years. But this time, Nathan Cross's enemy wasn't a bullet wound or a knife slash. His enemy was death itself, stalking a fragile life not yet 4 months old. "Prepare for intubation," Nathan Cross ordered, his voice calm but taut as a drawn wire. "Complete airway obstruction. Oxygen is below 70%. We have less than 5 minutes." Lorenzo stood frozen outside the glass, hands that had strangled enemies without a flicker now trembling as they pressed against the icy surface. He watched Nathan Cross guide the tube into the tiny throat, watched nurses suction the airway, watched the monitor flash red numbers in warning. He felt powerless. For the first time in 20 years, Lorenzo Russo felt completely powerless. He could buy this entire city. He could order anyone killed. He could bring the most powerful men to their knees. But he couldn't do a single thing to save the child fighting for life on the other side of the glass. "Oxygen is down to 65%, a nurse cried, panic breaking through her voice. "Her heart is weakening." "No," Lorenzo whispered, the sound tearing from him like the groan of a wounded animal. "No, please." And then, without knowing where it came from, his lips began to move with words he thought he had forgotten 20 years ago. "God, if you are real, please save this child." It was the first time Lorenzo had prayed since the night he was 16, kneeling beside his father's body with a bullet through his head, begging God to bring him back and receiving only silence. That night, Lorenzo swore he would never pray again. That night, he buried his faith along with his father. But now, staring at a tiny life battling death, Lorenzo was willing to kneel before any higher power if it meant saving the baby. "I beg you. I'll do anything. Please don't take her." 10 minutes passed like 10 years. Nathan Cross worked without pause, sweat soaking his forehead while his hands remained steady as stone. Then a long beep rang out, and the monitor shifted from red to green. "Oxygen is up to 75%, a nurse announced, her voice trembling with relief. 80, 85. She's stabilizing." Nathan Cross exhaled deeply, stepped back, and removed his mask. He turned toward the glass and, for the first time, noticed Lorenzo's presence. The doctor's eyes widened in shock as he saw the most powerful Mafia boss in Seattle standing there, eyes rimmed with red, hands still shaking against the glass. "She's out of immediate danger," Nathan Cross said through the intercom. "But we need to monitor her closely for potential brain injury from oxygen deprivation." Lorenzo nodded, but his gaze never left the small body on the hospital bed. Her skin had regained its color. Her lips were no longer purple. Her chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm with the ventilator. The baby was alive. And now, Lorenzo needed the truth. He needed to know who this child was. He needed to know why Scarlett had hidden her from him. He needed to see her. The doors of the emergency ward burst open with a loud crash, and Lorenzo spun around as if a gunshot had just gone off. Time stopped. The world dissolved. All that remained was the figure of a woman standing in the doorway, auburn hair soaked and plastered to her ashen face, green eyes wild with panic as they swept the room searching for something. "Scarlett." Lorenzo breathed her name without meaning to, his voice nothing more than a broken whisper. But she didn't hear him. She didn't see him. All her attention was fixed on the glass room behind Lorenzo, where the tiny child lay peacefully amid the medical machines. She rushed toward it like a frantic mother, brushing past Lorenzo without realizing it, trembling hands pressed against the glass. "My daughter," Scarlett sobbed, her voice shattering like glass. "My daughter, Mia. Mommy's here. Mommy's here." Lorenzo stood there, less than a single step away from her, and for the first time in a year, he saw clearly the woman who had once melted his frozen heart. Scarlett was frighteningly thin. Her high cheekbones jutted sharply from her hollowed face, her collarbones stark beneath lifeless pale skin. The sweater she wore was frayed at the elbows, its gray faded as if washed hundreds of times. Her loose, bleached jeans hung off her frame, proof of how much weight she had lost. Her canvas shoes were soaked with rain, one toe split and unraveling, and her hands, the hands that once painted beautiful worlds, were now rough and cracked, nails bitten down to stubs. Lorenzo felt as though someone had torn his chest open. Was this his Scarlett, the proud woman with fire in her eyes, the one who laughed softly when he clumsily made morning coffee, the one who lay in his arms and whispered that she had never been happier? How had she lived this past year to become so worn down? "Doctor," Scarlett pleaded when she saw Nathan Cross step out of the emergency room. "Is my daughter going to be okay? Please tell me she'll be okay. I'll do anything. I'll sell my blood, sell a kidney, anything. Just save my child." Nathan Cross glanced at Lorenzo, standing behind her, then back at Scarlett, his expression struggling to piece together a complicated puzzle. "She's out of danger, ma'am," he began. She'll be fine. A low voice cut in from behind Scarlet. She froze. That voice. She would recognize that voice even after 1,000 years. Scarlet turned slowly, as if trying to delay the inevitable moment, and her green eyes collided with the steel-gray gaze she had been running from for a year. "Lorenzo," she whispered, her face paler than the fluorescent lights. "You! What are you doing here?" Lorenzo stepped forward 1 pace, and Scarlet stepped back 1 pace, as if he were a dangerous predator. That reaction stabbed straight through Lorenzo's heart, but he didn't stop. "I own this hospital," he replied, his cold tone masking the storm raging inside him. "The question is, what are you doing here, Scarlet?" "With a 4-month-old daughter I never even knew existed." Scarlet trembled, dry, cracked lips moving without sound. She retreated another step until her back pressed against the glass of the emergency room. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice so weak she didn't believe it herself. "It has nothing to do with you. You don't know what I'm talking about," Lorenzo repeated slowly, his voice sweet as honey and sharp as a blade. "Then look me in the eyes and tell me the child in there isn't mine. Scarlet, look me in the eyes and lie the way you've been lying for a year." Scarlet didn't look at him. She turned her face away, narrow shoulders shaking in waves. Tears streamed down her hollow cheeks, dripping onto the cold hospital floor. Her silence was louder than any confession, and Lorenzo, the Mafia boss who had killed without hesitation, felt his knees weaken as if all the strength had been drained from his body. The baby inside was his. Scarlet had been pregnant when she left. She had given birth alone, raised the child alone, fought poverty and illness alone, and he, the most powerful man in Seattle, hadn't known a thing. "Why?" Lorenzo asked, his voice breaking for the first time in 20 years. "Why did you hide it from me, Scarlet? Why did you leave?" Scarlet looked up at him, and in those tear-soaked green eyes, Lorenzo saw something that shattered his heart. Fear. She was afraid of him. The woman who had once slept in his arms, kissed him as if he were her entire world, whispered love to him through endless nights, now looked at him like prey staring at a hunter. And Lorenzo knew the answer to every question he had was far more painful than silence itself. Nathan Cross cleared his throat softly, breaking the crushing silence that had settled over the emergency corridor. "She's awake," he said, his voice cautious, as if he were walking on thin ice. "The mother may go in." Scarlet turned instantly, leaving Lorenzo standing there with 1,000 unanswered questions. She pushed open the emergency room door and went inside. And Lorenzo, without asking permission from anyone, followed right behind her. Enzo tried to stop him, but a single glance from his boss froze him in place. The room was filled with the steady beeping of machines, the sharp scent of antiseptic burning his lungs. Scarlet rushed to the small bed, her calloused hands gently stroking her daughter's tiny face. "Mia," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Mommy's here. Mommy's here. My good girl. You scared me so much." Lorenzo stood a few steps away, gray eyes locked on the baby lying on the bed. Little Mia had opened her eyes, large and round, staring up at the ceiling with the dazed look of a soul that had just returned from the edge of death. And when the fluorescent light hit those eyes, Lorenzo felt as if a hammer had slammed into his chest. Gray eyes. Steel gray eyes. The kind every member of the Russo bloodline was born with. The eyes his father had. The eyes his grandfather had. The eyes he saw every morning in the mirror. Mia had those eyes. There was no mistaking them. No denying them. Lorenzo moved closer, his legs carrying him forward as if by their own will. Scarlet looked up, her body going taut as a drawn wire when she saw him approaching her child. "Don't," she said, her voice trembling. Lorenzo didn't stop. He stood beside the bed, looking down at the baby lying there. Mia turned her head, wide gray eyes meeting his. And in that moment, Lorenzo felt the world stop spinning. The baby looked at him, not afraid, not crying, just a clear, curious, innocent gaze, as if she were trying to understand who this strange man was. And Lorenzo, a Mafia boss who had killed without mercy, felt his knees give way. He dropped to his knees beside the hospital bed, his face level with the baby's, steel gray eyes now clouded by something he couldn't name. Tears. For the first time in 20 years, tears. "How old is she?" Lorenzo asked, his voice hoarse as if he were swallowing a lump lodged deep in his throat. He didn't look at Scarlet. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the baby's gray gaze. Scarlet was silent. Lorenzo turned to her and saw her biting her lip until it bled, hands gripping the bed rail so tightly her knuckles were white. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything. 4 months, Lorenzo answered himself, his voice a whisper from a man just sentenced to death. Enzo said she's 4 months old. He looked up at Scarlett, gray eyes bloodshot with emotion. You left 1 year ago. 9 months of pregnancy plus 4 months after birth. You were pregnant when you left me, weren't you? Scarlett turned her face away, tears sliding down her hollow cheeks. Lorenzo stood, walking toward her with steps heavy as lead. He stopped right in front of her, close enough to smell rain and antiseptic on her skin, close enough to see her trembling like a leaf in a storm. Look at me, he said, his low voice filled with authority and desperation. Scarlett, look at me and tell me the truth. Is that baby mine? Scarlett lifted her gaze. Green eyes met gray. And in that look, Lorenzo saw the answer he both wanted and feared. But Scarlett didn't speak. She only looked at him with eyes full of tears, lips trembling without sound. And that silence, that deadly silence, hurt more than any confession ever could. Because Lorenzo knew. He looked into the gray eyes of the baby and he knew. She was his daughter, his blood, his flesh, and for 4 months, he hadn't even known she existed. Why? Lorenzo asked again, his voice shattering like glass hitting a cold stone floor. Why did you hide it from me? Why did you leave without saying a single word? Scarlett closed her eyes, tears continuing to slide down her hollow cheeks. Memories from 1 year earlier surged like a flood, dragging her back to the day that changed her life forever. 1 year ago, in Scarlett's small apartment on the outskirts of Seattle, she had been sitting in front of her easel, an unfinished painting of a sunset over Puget Sound before her, when a knock sounded at the door. She thought it was Lorenzo, because he often came on evenings like this, bringing wine and that rare smile he showed only to her. But when she opened the door, it wasn't Lorenzo. It was a woman around 60 years old, silver hair swept into an elegant twist, an icy face with sharp gray eyes. Gray eyes. Exactly like Lorenzo's. The woman wore a refined black dress, a pearl necklace at her throat, diamond rings glinting on her fingers. Expensive perfume lingered faintly in the air. Behind her stood 2 large men in black suits, faces expressionless like stone statues. Scarlett Hayes, the woman said, her voice cold and devoid of emotion. I am Valentina Russo, Lorenzo's mother. Scarlett froze, because Lorenzo had never spoken of his family. He had only said his father died long ago and that he didn't have a good relationship with his mother. Before Scarlett could react, Valentina stepped into the apartment as if it were her own territory, gray eyes sweeping over the unfinished paintings on the walls with undisguised contempt. So this is where my son spends the nights he doesn't come home, Valentina said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. A rat hole with a starving little painter. Anger rushed to Scarlett's face, but she forced herself to stay calm. What do you want? I want you gone from my son's life, Valentina replied bluntly. She opened a leather briefcase held by one of the bodyguards, pulled out a thick folder, and threw it onto the table in front of Scarlett. Read it. Scarlett hesitated for a second before picking it up, and when she opened it, her world collapsed. Photographs. Dozens of them. Lorenzo standing beside men with terrifying faces. Lorenzo in secret meetings. Lorenzo entering and leaving buildings Scarlett recognized as strongholds of Seattle's most notorious gangs, and newspaper articles. Articles about the Russo Empire, about the youngest Mafia boss in the city's history, about murders, smuggling, extortion cases the police never had enough evidence to prosecute. My son isn't a businessman, Valentina said, her voice cold as ice. He is Lorenzo Russo, the most powerful Mafia boss on the West Coast. His hands are stained with the blood of hundreds. His enemies could line up from here all the way to New York. Scarlett couldn't breathe. She stared at the photographs, at the familiar face of the man she loved, the man who lay beside her every night, who kissed her and whispered sweet words. It was all a lie. All of it was a performance. She had never known who he really was. If you stay with my son, Valentina continued, her voice unwavering, you will die. Lorenzo's enemies will use you to control him. They will kidnap you, torture you, kill you in the most painful ways imaginable. And if you are carrying his child, that baby will die too. Scarlett trembled, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. She wasn't certain yet, but her period was 2 weeks late. She had planned to tell Lorenzo the following week, after confirming it with a test. I'll give you $1 million, Valentina said, placing a thick envelope on the table. Disappear from Seattle. Disappear from my son's life. Never contact him again. If you refuse, I'll make sure you don't live long enough to regret it. Scarlett looked at the envelope, then up at Valentina's cold face. She didn't need the money. She wasn't afraid of threats. But she was afraid of something else. She was afraid that if she was pregnant, Her child would grow up in a world of blood and violence. She was afraid that Lorenzo, the man she loved, was truly a killer. She was afraid that everything she believed was real had only been an illusion. "I don't need your money," Scarlett said, her voice shaking but her eyes proud. "I'll leave. But not because you threaten me, because I don't want to live in the world of people like you and your son." That night, Scarlett packed her things and left the apartment. She took nothing but a few clothes and her art supplies. She left no farewell letter, no message, no trace. She vanished as if she had never existed. And 2 weeks later, when the pregnancy test showed 2 red lines, Scarlett sat alone in a cheap rented room on the outskirts of Portland and cried until she had no tears left. She was carrying the child of a Mafia boss, and she was completely alone. 9 months of pregnancy were 9 months of living hell. Scarlett returned to Seattle after a few weeks in Portland because she didn't have enough money to start a new life in an unfamiliar city. She rented a tiny apartment in the southern slums of the city, a place she was certain Lorenzo and the Russo empire would never set foot in. The apartment had only one room, less than 20 square meters, with damp walls peeling in patches and rusted pipes dripping day and night. Rats scurried everywhere, and Scarlett stuffed rags into cracks in the walls to keep them from crawling onto her bed. The window wouldn't close properly, icy wind pouring in every night, forcing her to curl up inside the single thin blanket she owned. But that was all she could afford on an income of $300 a month from selling street paintings. To survive, Scarlett worked 3 jobs at once. In the mornings, she woke at 5 o'clock to wait tables at a cafe until noon. In the afternoons, she worked as a janitor in an office building downtown, mopping floors, scrubbing toilets, hauling trash. In the evenings, she went to Pike Place Market to draw portraits for tourists until her legs swelled so badly she could barely stand. Every day, she worked 16 to 18 hours and earned less than $50. That money barely covered rent and enough food to get through the day. Her belly grew larger, but she didn't dare rest. No one hired a pregnant woman. The final months of pregnancy were the hardest. Scarlett hid her belly under oversized sweaters to avoid being fired. She waited tables with feet so swollen she couldn't fit into shoes, wearing cheap sandals to work in the freezing winter. She knelt to scrub toilet floors with a 7-month belly pressed into her chest, leaving her gasping for air, nearly fainting more than once in public restrooms. She sat outside drawing while snow fell, her hands so numb she could barely hold the brush. Yet she forced herself to finish each portrait for a few extra dollars. Some nights, Scarlett lay curled up in that wretched apartment, clutching her belly and crying until she had nothing left. She missed Lorenzo. She missed his warm arms. She missed the nights he held her and whispered that he'd protect her from everything. But then she remembered the photographs in the folder, remembered his blood-stained hands, remembered Valentina's threats, and she knew she couldn't go back. She couldn't let her child grow up in that world. The night Scarlett gave birth, she was completely alone. Labor came without warning, while she was cleaning a toilet in the office building, her water breaking and soaking the floor she had just scrubbed. She called a taxi with the last coins in her wallet and went to a public hospital as an uninsured patient. The labor lasted 18 hours. Scarlett gritting her teeth through contractions that tore her body apart with no one holding her hand, no one encouraging her. And when baby Mia was born with a weak cry, Scarlett nearly died with her. Postpartum hemorrhage. The doctor said she lost nearly 2 liters of blood, her heart stopping for 30 seconds before they managed to revive her. She lay in intensive care for 3 days, with no family visiting, no flowers, no gifts, just her and the newborn lying in a plastic bassinet beside the bed, wide gray eyes staring at her, as if asking why the world was so cold. Scarlett held her baby and cried, swearing that even if it killed her, she'd protect this child. After leaving the hospital, life grew even harder. Scarlett couldn't work 3 jobs anymore because she had to care for the baby, her income dropping to less than half. She sold every painting she once kept as memories, even sold her art supplies to buy milk and diapers. Many nights, she went hungry to save money for formula, lying there holding her child while her empty stomach burned with hunger. The slum apartment now reeked of dirty diapers she couldn't afford to replace, washing and reusing them again and again. And then tonight, when Mia suddenly struggled to breathe, lips turning purple, her body going limp as if life were slipping away, Scarlett ran 2 kilometers through the storm to the nearest hospital because she didn't have money for a taxi. She didn't know it was Seattle General. She didn't know it was Lorenzo's hospital. She only knew her daughter was dying in her arms, and she had to save her at any cost. Scarlett opened her eyes, returning to the present to find Lorenzo's gray eyes fixed on her. He'd heard everything. He'd stood there in silence, listening to every detail of the 12 months of hell she'd endured. And on the face of the Mafia boss, cold as ice. Scarlett saw something she'd never seen before. Tears. Lorenzo Russo was crying. Lorenzo stood motionless in the emergency room, tears streaming down the hardened face of the Mafia boss. He had listened to Scarlett recount every detail, every day of the hell she had endured, and each word cut into his chest like a blade. But there was one thing she said that he couldn't ignore. A woman who claimed to be his mother had gone to see her. "Enzo," Lorenzo called, his voice low and rumbling like thunder before a storm. "Investigate immediately. Everything about Scarlett's past 12 months. And find out exactly what my mother did." Enzo nodded and disappeared down the hospital corridor. Lorenzo turned back to Scarlett and little Mia sleeping peacefully on the hospital bed. "Stay here," he said, his voice softer but still carrying command. "Don't go anywhere. I'll be back." Scarlett didn't answer. She only looked at him with exhausted eyes, then turned to hold her daughter close. Lorenzo walked out of the emergency ward, each step heavy as if weighed down by lead. He went to the hospital director's office, a room he owned but had never used, and sat down to wait. 2 hours later, Enzo returned carrying a thick file. The face of Lorenzo's right hand was pale, his eyes unable to meet his boss's. "Sir," Enzo said, his voice trembling in a way Lorenzo had never heard before. "I think you should prepare yourself before you read this." Lorenzo snatched the file without a word. He opened it and began to read. The first page was a report on Scarlett's life over the past 12 months. An address in the southern slums of the city. Rent $150 a month. Living space less than 20 square meters. The photographs of the apartment made Lorenzo's breath catch. Mold-stained walls, a leaking ceiling, rats everywhere. His daughter had lived in a place like that for her first 4 months of life. The second page listed Scarlett's jobs. Cafe waitress, $7 an hour. Office building janitor, $6.50 an hour. Street artist, irregular income. Total earnings around $50 a day for 16 to 18 hours of work. Lorenzo clenched the file until the pages crumpled. The third page was medical records from a public hospital. Prolonged labor lasting 18 hours. Postpartum hemorrhage with blood loss nearing 2 liters. Cardiac arrest lasting 30 seconds. Successfully resuscitated. Discharged after 3 days with no family present. Lorenzo's hands began to shake. And then the final page. A report detailing the meeting between Valentina Russo and Scarlett Hayes 1 year earlier. Date, location, and an audio recording from a security camera inside Scarlett's apartment that Valentina didn't know existed. Lorenzo pressed play on the attached flash drive. His mother's voice filled the silent room. "If you continue to stay with my son, you'll die. Lorenzo's enemies will use you to control him. They'll kidnap you, torture you, kill you in the most painful way possible. And if you're carrying his child, that baby will die too." Lorenzo stopped the recording. For a moment, the room was suffocatingly silent. Then the rage exploded. The massive oak desk weighing hundreds of kilograms was kicked into the wall with a terrifying crash. Chairs flew across the room. Glass doors shattered. A computer monitor burst apart when it slammed into the floor. Lorenzo roared like a wounded beast, his hands destroying everything within reach. Enzo stood frozen at the doorway, unable to intervene, watching his boss demolish the room. 10 minutes later, Lorenzo stood amid the wreckage, breathing hard, hands bleeding from shards of glass. But he felt no pain. Physical pain was nothing compared to the agony tearing his heart apart. His mother had done this. His mother had driven Scarlett away. His mother had threatened to kill her and the child in her womb. His mother had known about her granddaughter, and still let her live in hell for 4 months. "Get the car ready," Lorenzo said, his voice icy and lethal. "We're going to the Russo estate." 20 minutes later, the black Maybach stopped in front of the grand villa where Valentina Russo lived. Lorenzo entered without knocking, blood-soaked shoes leaving red marks on the pristine white marble floor. Valentina sat in the living room, sipping tea, as if she had been expecting him. "Lorenzo," she said calmly, "I heard you went to the hospital tonight. Is something important happening?" Lorenzo threw the file onto the table in front of her, gray eyes burning with fury. "You knew," he said, his voice shaking from restraint. "You knew I had a daughter. You knew Scarlett was pregnant when you drove her away. You hid my child from me for an entire year." Valentina set her teacup down, her face still expressionless. "I did what was necessary to protect you and protect the Russo family. That girl wasn't worthy of you. She's just a starving artist with no family and no status. She would have been your weakness. Your enemies would have used her to destroy you." Lorenzo stepped closer to his mother, gray eyes like twin pits of ice. "Scarlett nearly died giving birth to my child," he said, each word dripping like venom. "My daughter lived in a slum for 4 months. And tonight, She nearly died because there was no money to get her to a hospital. All of it is because of you." Lorenzo leaned down until his face was only inches from Valentina's. "If you weren't my mother," he said slowly, "I'd kill you right here." For the first time that night, Valentina's face went pale, and Lorenzo turned and walked away, leaving his mother sitting there in deadly silence. At the same time, on the other side of Seattle, inside an old mansion perched atop Queen Anne Hill, a 45-year-old man sat in the darkness listening to a report from one of his operatives. Victor Castellano lit a Cuban cigar, the flickering flame illuminating an angular face marked by a long scar running from his temple to his chin. His eyes, black as bottomless pits, cold and merciless, gleamed with amusement as he absorbed every word the informant delivered. Victor Castellano was the head of the Castellano family, the second largest mafia empire on the west coast of the United States, surpassed only by the Russo family. 20 years earlier, Lorenzo's father had killed Victor's older brother in a brutal war over territory. From that day on, Victor swore he would wipe the Russo bloodline from the face of the earth. But Lorenzo was too strong, too intelligent, too ruthless. Every time Victor tried to strike, he failed miserably. Lorenzo's empire grew ever more solid while the Castellano power steadily weakened. Victor had waited 20 long years to find Lorenzo Russo's weakness. And tonight, that weakness had revealed itself. "Say it again," Victor ordered, cigar smoke coiling around his scarred face. The informant bowed his head, voice trembling with fear of his notoriously cruel boss. "Sir, Lorenzo Russo went to Seattle General tonight. A 4-month-old baby girl was brought into emergency care. The mother is Scarlett Hayes, Lorenzo's former lover. According to hospital sources, the child has the distinctive gray eyes of the Russo bloodline. Lorenzo stayed at the hospital all night and ordered the baby transferred to the most exclusive VIP suite." Victor exhaled a slow ring of smoke, his dark eyes glittering like a serpent's before striking prey. "Lorenzo Russo has a daughter," he murmured with cruel delight. "The untouchable boss turns out to have a deadly weakness. 20 years I waited. 20 years I searched for a way to destroy the Russo family. And at last, heaven has opened its eyes." Victor rose and walked to the window, gazing down at the city of Seattle buried in darkness. Somewhere below, Lorenzo was preoccupied with his newly discovered daughter and his former lover. The Russo boss was surely distracted now, letting emotion overrule reason. This was the perfect opportunity Victor had waited 20 years for. "Learn everything about that child and her mother," Victor commanded, his voice cold as steel. "I want to know where they are, what they're doing, how many guards protect them." "Miss nothing," the informant nodded. "Sir, what about Lorenzo?" Victor turned back, a vicious smile spreading across his lips. "Lorenzo is the strongest warrior I've ever faced. But even the strongest warrior can be brought down when their heart is struck. That child is Lorenzo's heart now. I don't need to kill Lorenzo. I only need to kill his heart." Victor moved to his desk, opened a drawer, and took out a gold-plated pistol engraved with the Castellano family crest. He caressed the barrel like a lover, dark eyes fixed on the shadows. 20 years ago, a Russo killed my brother," Victor whispered, his voice thick with hatred. "Now I'll take the most precious thing the Russo family has. Blood for blood, life for life." He turned to the informant, trembling in the corner. "Summon all my top assassins. Prepare the attack plan. I want everything perfect before we move. Lorenzo Russo will pay for what his father did, and I'll begin by taking his precious little daughter." The informant bowed and hurried out of the room. Victor remained alone in the darkness, cigar smoke swirling around him like ghosts waiting to be unleashed. The war was about to begin, and this time, Victor swore he wouldn't let Lorenzo Russo survive. Meanwhile, at Seattle General, Lorenzo was still sitting beside little Mia's hospital bed, completely unaware that darkness was slowly closing in on the people he loved most. For the first time in his life, the most powerful mafia boss in Seattle had a weakness, and his enemy had seen it. 3 days after the fateful night at the hospital, little Mia had stabilized and was moved to a VIP room on the 12th floor of Seattle General. Lorenzo wanted to bring both of them back to the Russo estate immediately, but Dr. Nathan Cross advised a few more days of observation to ensure there were no neurological complications. Scarlett refused every offer from Lorenzo. She insisted on staying at the hospital alone with her daughter and wanted no help from him. Lorenzo didn't force her, but he secretly stationed 2 bodyguards outside the hospital room around the clock. That night, Lorenzo had to leave the hospital to handle an emergency meeting with allied gang bosses. The meeting had been postponed since the night Mia was admitted, and the bosses were growing impatient. He kissed his sleeping daughter's forehead, glanced at Scarlett, curled up on the sofa in the corner of the room, then reluctantly walked out. He didn't know it would be the biggest mistake of his life. At 2 a.m, when the hospital lay submerged in silence, 3 dark figures glided down the 12th floor corridor like ghosts. They wore nurse uniforms, caps, and masks that hid their faces, pushing a medication cart as if performing routine duties. Lorenzo's 2 bodyguards standing outside the room suspected nothing. One of the 3 figures smiled behind the mask, then pulled 2 daggers from beneath the cart. Before the guards could react, their throats were slit cleanly, blood spraying in dark red arcs across the pristine white hallway walls. Their bodies collapsed to the floor with dull thuds, without a single cry. Inside the hospital room, Scarlett was dozing on the sofa when the strange noise jolted her awake. A mother's instinct made her spring up instantly, green eyes sweeping the dim room. The door opened slowly, and the 3 figures stepped inside. Scarlett froze when she saw the fresh blood staining their white uniforms, the daggers gleaming in their hands, and the cold predator eyes fixed on the crib where Mia slept. "No!" Scarlett screamed, lunging toward the crib like a tigress protecting her cub. She grabbed Mia and clutched her to her chest just as one assassin swung his blade down where the baby had been, the steel tearing through the bedsheet. "Give us the baby!" The first assassin snarled, his voice hoarse like the hiss of a venomous snake. "Don't make this hard, bitch. You can live if you cooperate." Scarlett backed into the corner, her spine pressed against the wall, arms wrapped around Mia so tightly the baby began to scream. She searched desperately for something to defend herself, but the room held nothing but medical equipment and the sofa. She was alone. She was weak. She had no chance against 3 professional killers, but she was a mother, and a mother could do anything to protect her child. "If you want my daughter," Scarlett roared, her voice shaking but eyes blazing, "you'll have to step over my dead body." The first assassin sneered and charged. Scarlett dodged sideways and kicked his knee hard, making him stagger. She ran toward the window, but the second man blocked her path. He punched her square in the face, and Scarlett reeled but didn't loosen her grip on her baby. Blood poured from her nose, soaking her shirt and dripping onto Mia's screaming face. The third assassin lunged from behind, grabbing Scarlett's hair and yanking her head back. She screamed in pain but still didn't let go. He punched her back, her stomach, her ribs, each blow like a sledgehammer crashing into the frail body of a woman already destroyed by a year of hell. Scarlett collapsed to the floor, but her arms remained locked around Mia like iron clamps. "Let go," the assassin roared, yanking her hair so hard a clump tore free. "You filthy bitch. Drop the baby." "No," Scarlett sobbed, blood and tears mixing on her swollen face. Kill me, but don't touch my child." The first assassin lost patience and raised his knife, ready to stab Scarlett's arm to force her to release the baby. The blade flashed in the darkness, and Scarlett squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the ripping pain. But the stab never came. A gunshot exploded through the room, and the first assassin collapsed to the floor with a hole between his eyes. Scarlett opened her eyes, and through the haze of blood, she saw a figure standing in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, gray eyes burning like twin pits of hellfire. Lorenzo Russo stood there, a smoking gun in his hand, his face frozen in ice while his eyes blazed with the madness of a wild beast whose family had been threatened. And in that moment, Scarlett saw the true face of the Mafia boss for the first time. The face of a killer. Lorenzo didn't say a word. He stepped into the hospital room with slow, deliberate strides, gray eyes never leaving the 2 remaining assassins who stood frozen in shock. The gun in his hand was still smoking, the sharp scent of gunpowder filling the air. Enzo and 4 other bodyguards appeared behind him with weapons raised, but Lorenzo lifted a hand to stop them. "Leave them to me," he said, his voice low and distant like thunder rolling across the horizon. "I want to handle this myself." The second assassin panicked and reached for his gun, but Lorenzo was faster. He knocked the weapon aside and seized the man by the throat, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing at all. The assassin's legs flailed uselessly, his face turning purple as air vanished from his lungs. But Lorenzo didn't release his grip. He tightened it, steel-gray eyes locked onto the gaze of the man dying in his hands. "Who sent you?" Lorenzo asked calmly, as if he were asking about the weather. The assassin couldn't answer, his mouth opening and closing in a desperate attempt to breathe. Lorenzo loosened his grip just enough for one gasp of air. "Castellano," the man rasped. "Victor Castellano. He wants the baby to threaten you." Lorenzo nodded slowly, as though he'd expected nothing else. Then he tightened his hand again. The sound of a neck snapping echoed dry and final through the silent room. The second assassin collapsed like an empty sack, eyes frozen open toward the ceiling. Lorenzo dropped the body without emotion and turned to the last man. The third assassin had lost all courage. He fell to his knees, hands raised above his head, begging, "Please spare me. I was just following orders. I have a wife and children. Please." Lorenzo walked closer, expensive leather shoes stepping into the spreading pool of blood on the floor. He crouched and grabbed the man's chin, forcing him to look into eyes as cold as hell itself. "You have a wife and children," Lorenzo said slowly, each word dripping like acid. "And yet you came here to kill my daughter, a 4-month-old baby. Please," the assassin sobbed, tears and mucus streaming down his face. "I had no choice. Castellano would have killed my family if I didn't do it." Lorenzo was silent for a moment, as if considering this. Then he straightened, pulled the dagger from the hand of the first dead assassin, the blade gleaming under the hospital lights. "I'll give you a choice," Lorenzo said, his voice sweet as honey and cold as ice. "You can die fast, or you can die slow. It depends on whether you tell me everything I want to know." 10 minutes later, the third assassin had confessed to everything. Victor Castellano's plan, the number of killers deployed, the timing and location of the next attack. He spoke without pause, not daring to hide a single detail, because Lorenzo had already severed 2 of his fingers during the interrogation to make sure he didn't lie. When Lorenzo finally slit the man's throat, ending the torture, the hospital room had become a slaughterhouse. 3 bodies lay twisted across the floor, blood soaking into the walls and bed, the metallic stench thick in the air. And in the middle of that ruin, Lorenzo stood in his expensive suit drenched in blood, hands crimson as if dipped in paint, his face utterly devoid of emotion. He turned toward Scarlett, and that was when he saw her eyes. Scarlett was still crouched in the corner, clutching a screaming Mia against her chest. Her face was swollen from the beating, dried blood crusted around her mouth and nose, but her green eyes were wide with terror. She looked at Lorenzo the way one looks at a monster dragged straight from hell, not with gratitude for being saved, not with relief that her daughter was alive, only pure primal fear, the fear of prey staring at a predator. Lorenzo felt as though his heart had been torn from his chest. He'd killed in front of her. He'd tortured a man begging for mercy in front of her. He'd shown her the monster hidden beneath the Armani suit and the rare gentle smile. "Scarlett." Lorenzo stepped closer, reaching out to her. "Are you hurt? Let me. Don't come near me," Scarlett screamed, her voice shattering with fear. "Don't touch my child." Lorenzo froze, his arms suspended in the air before falling helplessly to his side. He looked down at his hands soaked in blood, and for the first time in his life, the Mafia boss felt disgust toward himself. "You're afraid of me," Lorenzo whispered, his voice catching as if he were swallowing shards of glass. Scarlett didn't answer. She only held her daughter tighter, trembling in the corner, eyes fixed on the blood-stained hands of the man she'd once loved. And Lorenzo knew that even though he'd saved her life and his daughter's, he'd also lost her forever. The next morning, when the first sunlight filtered through the hospital windows, Scarlett made a decision she never thought she would make. She agreed to go to the Russo estate, not because she forgave Lorenzo, not because she was no longer afraid of him, but because she was afraid of something even more than she was afraid of him. She was afraid of losing her daughter. 3 assassins had walked into the hospital as if it were an empty building, killing 2 bodyguards as easily as slaughtering chickens. If Lorenzo hadn't arrived in time, Mia would have been taken or worse. Scarlett knew she couldn't protect her child on her own. She had no money, no power, no weapons. She was just a poor painter with calloused hands and a shattered heart. Lorenzo's enemies had guns, knives, and entire squads of killers ready to spill blood. So when Lorenzo asked if she would agree to go to the estate for safety, Scarlett nodded. She nodded with a heart as heavy as lead, and eyes that couldn't bring themselves to meet his. The Russo estate sat atop Magnolia Hill, overlooking the full sweep of Puget Sound in a breathtaking panorama. The 3-story Mediterranean-style villa gleamed with white walls, red-tiled roofs, and imposing marble columns. The grounds stretched wide with fountains, sculptures, and perfectly trimmed rose gardens. Inside, the luxury was dizzying. Polished Italian marble floors reflected the glow of crystal chandeliers. Masterpieces by renowned painters lined the walls, each worth more than Scarlett could earn in a lifetime. The furnishings were exquisitely chosen with Italian leather sofas, hand-carved oak tables, and hand-woven Persian rugs. Scarlett was given a private room on the 2nd floor, right next to Mia's. The room was 10 times larger than the slum apartment she had lived in, with a king-size bed draped in silk sheets, a walk-in closet, and a balcony overlooking the rose garden. Mia's room looked like something from a fairy tale, with an oak crib carved with angels, expensive stuffed animals everywhere, and a colorful mural straight out of a storybook. But to Scarlett, all that luxury felt like nothing more than a gilded prison. She wasn't allowed to leave the estate without bodyguards. Every door was guarded. Security cameras watched every corner. Every step she took was monitored. She felt like a bird trapped in a golden cage, fed well, surrounded by beauty, but never free to fly. Lorenzo tried to reach her, but Scarlett built an invisible wall between them. Whenever he entered the room, she found a reason to leave. Whenever he asked if she needed anything, she shook her head and turned away. Whenever he tried to touch her, even a gentle hand on her shoulder, she flinched as if burned. Scarlett couldn't forget the image of Lorenzo snapping a man's neck with his bare hands. She couldn't forget the dry crack of breaking bone in the night. She couldn't forget the way he tortured the assassin, cutting off fingers with cold, calm precision, as if slicing meat. That wasn't the Lorenzo she had loved. That was a monster, and that monster was the father of her daughter. Every night, Scarlett lay on the soft silk bed, staring up at the high ceiling, wondering what she was doing there. She had run from Lorenzo once to protect her child from his violent world, and now she had brought her child right back into it. She felt like a terrible mother, like she had failed. But she had no other choice. Outside, Mia would die. Inside these walls, at least her daughter lived. Even if it meant living in a prison. Even if it meant growing up beside a father who was a monster. Every night, Lorenzo stood outside Scarlett's door, listening to her cry in the darkness. He wanted to go in, to hold her, to tell her he was sorry, that he would change, that he loved her. But he knew she didn't want to see him. He knew she was afraid of him, and that was the greatest pain Lorenzo Russo had ever endured. 2 weeks passed inside the Russo estate, and Scarlett began to notice something strange. Lorenzo was changing, not in the way she hoped for, or in a way she could immediately trust, but in small, undeniable ways she couldn't ignore. He started coming home earlier. Before, according to Enzo, Lorenzo often worked until midnight, or even stayed awake all night, handling the affairs of the Russo empire. Now, he came home before 7 every evening, just to see Mia before she fell asleep. The first time Lorenzo tried to hold his daughter was an unforgettable disaster. The Mafia boss who had killed without hesitation stood rigid beside the crib, hands that once snapped enemies' necks now trembling as he tried to lift a 4-month-old baby. He held Mia like a ticking bomb, stiff and clumsy enough that she started screaming in discomfort. Scarlett stood in the doorway, unsure whether to step in or let it happen, and finally chose to stay silent and watch. Lorenzo fumbled for the right position, tried resting Mia's head on his shoulder, then switched to cradling her horizontally, sweat soaking his forehead as if he were facing the most dangerous enemy of his life. 10 minutes later, when he finally found a position that made Mia stop crying, Lorenzo's face relaxed with a look of relief Scarlett had never seen before. He looks like a child who's just learned his first lesson, she thought, and in that moment her heart twinged with a strange feeling she didn't dare name. In the days that followed, Lorenzo kept learning how to be a father with astonishing persistence. He learned how to change diapers, even though the first time he put it on backward and had to redo it 3 times before getting it right. He learned how to prepare formula, even though the first batch was too hot and had to be thrown away. He learned how to bathe her, even though the first time soap splashed into Mia's eyes, making her scream and sending him into a panic as he called his private doctor to check on her. The household staff whispered among themselves about their master's transformation. They had never seen Lorenzo Russo like this. The cold, ruthless boss could now sit for hours beside a crib just to watch his daughter sleep. The man who once ordered deaths without blinking could now panic at the sound of his daughter sneezing. This was a different Lorenzo. A Lorenzo no one in Seattle's underworld believed could exist. But the moment that truly changed everything came late one night when the clock read 2 a.m. Scarlett was awakened by Mia crying in the next room. She was about to get up and soothe her as usual when she heard footsteps already reaching Mia's room. She quietly opened her door and peeked into the dim hallway. Mia's door was ajar, warm yellow nightlight spilling out, and she saw Lorenzo. The Mafia boss sat in the rocking chair beside the crib, holding his daughter in his arms. He wasn't wearing his Armani suit, just a black t-shirt and sleep pants, dark hair tousled as if he'd just leapt from bed. And he was singing. Lorenzo's voice was deep and rough, not beautiful, slightly off-key, but he was singing a lullaby Scarlett didn't recognize, perhaps an old Italian folk song, because the words sounded unfamiliar while the melody was strangely gentle. Mia had stopped crying. She lay quietly in her father's arms, wide gray eyes gazing up at Lorenzo's face as if hypnotized by that clumsy voice. And Lorenzo, the most ruthless mafia boss in Seattle, was looking at his daughter with an expression Scarlett had never seen in anyone. the look of pure love, the look of a man realizing for the first time that he could love someone more than his own life. Scarlett stood there in the darkness, tears sliding down her cheeks without her noticing. She watched Lorenzo's hands that had killed and tortured, now gently caressing his daughter's cheek, as if afraid of bruising a flower petal. She watched his face, the icy face she had once feared, now soft and warm as if darkness had never touched it. "My daughter," Lorenzo whispered, when the song ended and Mia had fallen asleep in his arms. "I'm sorry I wasn't there from the beginning. I'm sorry your mother had to suffer alone. I swear I'll protect you until my last breath. No one will touch you. No one will ever hurt you. Even if I have to burn the whole world, I'll keep you safe." Lorenzo gently placed Mia back in the crib, tucked the blanket around her, and sat there watching her sleep for a long time. He didn't know Scarlett was standing outside the door, watching him, crying over emotions she couldn't control. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to fear him. She wanted to keep her distance forever. But watching him there in the middle of the night, singing softly to their daughter, looking at her with eyes full of love, Scarlett felt the wall she'd built around her heart begin to crack. Maybe he was a monster. But even monsters could learn how to love. And maybe, just maybe, this monster was loving their daughter with his entire dark heart. 1 week after the night, Scarlett witnessed Lorenzo singing a lullaby to their daughter. Things began to change even though she didn't want to admit it. She no longer avoided Lorenzo the way she had before. She allowed him to hold Mia every evening before the baby fell asleep. She even began sitting at the dinner table with him instead of locking herself away in her room. The walls she had built were slowly crumbling, one brick at a time. But there was one person who refused to accept that. Valentina Russo arrived at the estate one afternoon, while Lorenzo was busy in a meeting downtown. She walked in as if it were still her house, cold gray eyes sweeping across the living room where Scarlett sat feeding Mia a bottle. Dozens of servants stood throughout the space cleaning, arranging flowers, preparing dinner, and all of them froze when the former mistress of the house appeared. "So this is the girl who seduced my son," Valentina said, her voice carrying across the vast living room. "I thought you ran off with the money I gave you. Turns out you came back to cling to Lorenzo through this child." Scarlett looked up, her face draining of color but her green eyes remaining steady. "I didn't take your money. I already told you that." Valentina sneered and stepped closer, stopping a few paces away, looking down at Scarlett as if she were a repulsive insect. "You didn't take the money, but you accepted the mansion," she mocked. "From a slum apartment to a castle thanks to a baby. Quite a talent. I must admit you're more capable than I thought." The servants stood silent like statues, but Scarlett knew they were hearing every word. Heat rushed to her face with humiliation, yet she didn't respond. She only held Mia tighter and lowered her gaze, trying to ignore the insults. But Valentina didn't stop. She moved closer, her voice growing sharper. "Look at you. Ragged clothes, calloused hands like a servant. Do you think you deserve to stand beside my son? Do you think you deserve to be the mother of the Russo heir? You're just a poor whore using your belly to climb your way up." Scarlett bit her lip until it bled, tears welling, but she refused to cry in front of this woman. She had endured a year of hell. She had given birth alone, nearly died from hemorrhaging, raised her child in hunger. She didn't need to prove her worth to anyone. Still, Valentina's words cut like knives. "I will demand a DNA test," Valentina declared, her voice echoing through the room. "I don't believe this child is my grandchild. Perhaps she belongs to some man you slept with for money." The servants began to murmur, and that was the breaking point. Scarlett stood up abruptly, green eyes blazing with fury. "You have no right to insult me like that," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You drove me away when I was pregnant. You let your grandchild live in a slum for 4 months. You have no right to question my child's blood." Valentina paled at being challenged and raised her hand to slap Scarlett, but that hand never reached her face. Another hand stopped it midair. Lorenzo stood there, face cold as ice, gray eyes burning like twin pits of hellfire. No one knew when he had returned, but he had heard enough. "What are you doing here?" Lorenzo asked, his voice low and threatening. Valentina pulled her hand back, forcing calm into her expression. "I came to see my grandchild, and to remind this girl of her place in our family." Lorenzo stepped forward, positioning himself between his mother and Scarlett like a living wall. "Scarlett's place is beside me and Mia," he said slowly, each word fired like a bullet. "She is the mother of my daughter. She deserves respect in this house, and if you can't respect her, you are not welcome here." Valentina went pale. "You dare speak to your mother like this over a whore. You choose her over your own blood." "Scarlett is my blood," Lorenzo roared, gray eyes bloodshot with rage. "Mia is my blood. And you betrayed me when you drove Scarlett away and hid my daughter from me. You have no right to question anyone's loyalty." The room fell into absolute silence. The servants stood frozen, barely daring to breathe. Valentina looked at her son with wounded fury, but in the end she turned and left without another word. When her footsteps faded, Lorenzo turned to Scarlett. She stood there clutching Mia, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," Lorenzo said softly. "I should have been here to protect you." Scarlett didn't speak. She only looked at him with tear-filled eyes. And in that gaze, Lorenzo saw something shifting. She no longer looked at him with fear. She looked at him like a man who had chosen to stand with her instead of standing with his own blood. And for the first time since they reunited, Scarlett felt that maybe she had been wrong about Lorenzo Russo. Valentina Russo was not a woman who accepted defeat easily. 3 days after the confrontation at the estate, when her son had thrown her out of the house in front of the servants, she swore that Scarlett Hayes would pay for it. If Lorenzo wouldn't listen to her, she would let the whole world judge that girl, and Valentina had more than enough money and power to make it happen. On Monday morning, while Lorenzo was meeting with allied gang leaders to plan their response to Victor Castellano, the media storm began. It started with an article in the Seattle Times bearing a sensational headline that read, "The dark secret of billionaire mafia boss Lorenzo Russo's lover from street thief to mother of a rich heiress." The article ran 2,000 words, detailed down to every comma, laying out Scarlett Hayes' past: orphaned young, raised in foster care, arrested for theft at 16. Accompanying the story was a blurry security camera image from a neighborhood grocery store 11 years earlier, showing a thin teenage girl stuffing a loaf of bread into her jacket. Police records and juvenile court documents followed, all published without restraint. Scarlett read the article on her phone with shaking hands. She remembered that day, 16 years old. The foster home had cut food rations because of budget shortages. She hadn't eaten for 3 days. She passed the grocery store, saw the loaf of bread on the shelf, and her stomach twisted with hunger. She only wanted to eat. She didn't want to be a thief, but hunger was stronger than pride. She was caught the moment she stepped outside. The police handcuffed her like a dangerous criminal. She was taken to juvenile court, stamped into a record, branded a thief for the rest of her life, all for a loaf of bread that cost less than $2. And now, 11 years later, that past had been dragged out to destroy her. The Seattle Times article was only the beginning. Within hours, dozens of other outlets republished the story with even more lurid headlines. The con artist who trapped a billionaire, from foster care to a multi-million-dollar mansion, the social climb of Scarlett Hayes. The mafia boss's daughter, noble blood, or the product of a scheme. Social media exploded. Hashtags about Scarlett trended nationwide. People called her a gold digger, a whore, a fraud. They dug into every corner of her life, from the paintings she sold at Pike Place Market to the slum apartment she once lived in. They made memes, wrote vicious comments, even sent threats to every account they believed belonged to her. Then the media descended on the Russo estate. Dozens of reporters, cameramen, and broadcast vans crowded the gates. Cameras pointed at every car entering or leaving, voices shouting questions at anyone who appeared. Scarlett stood behind the bedroom curtains, staring down at the chaotic crowd outside, feeling as though she were drowning. She knew who was behind all of this. Only one person had the money to buy information, the connections to push it into the press, and the motive to destroy her. Valentina Russo. When Lorenzo returned home that evening, he found Scarlett curled up in a corner of the living room, eyes swollen from crying. Her phone shattered on the floor as if she'd thrown it against the wall. Mia slept peacefully in her crib, unaware of the storm tearing her mother's life apart. Lorenzo had read every article on the way home. He had seen the cruel comments online. He had seen the reporters surrounding the gates. He knew this was his mother's doing. "Scarlett," Lorenzo said softly as he sat beside her. "I'm sorry. I'll fix this." Scarlett looked up at him, green eyes soaked with tears and bitterness. "How?" she asked, her voice breaking with despair. "The whole world knows I'm a thief. The whole world is calling me a lying whore. Can you erase the internet? Can you make millions of people forget what they've read?" Lorenzo fell silent. He had no answer. He could kill enemies. He could dismantle empires. But he couldn't control public opinion. He couldn't silence the world. "I was 16, Scarlett said through sobs. "I was hungry. I hadn't eaten in 3 days. I took one loaf of bread, one loaf that cost $1.80, and now, 11 years later, I'm still paying for it." Lorenzo pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear if he let go. Scarlett didn't push him away this time. She was too exhausted, too broken, too desperate to resist. She simply collapsed against him and cried, for the starving 16-year-old girl she once was, and for the 27-year-old woman being judged by the world today. And Lorenzo, the most powerful mafia boss in Seattle, felt completely helpless for the first time in his life. He could protect Scarlett from bullets and knives, but he couldn't protect her from the venomous words of millions of strangers on the internet. And that was a weapon he didn't know how to fight. The next morning, when Lorenzo woke up, he found Scarlett standing in her bedroom with a small suitcase open on the bed. She was folding clothes, the old ones she had brought from the slum apartment, not the expensive dresses Lorenzo had bought for her. Mia lay in the crib beside her, wide gray eyes watching her mother with quiet confusion. "What are you doing?" Lorenzo asked, his voice hoarse with worry. Scarlett didn't turn around. She kept folding, her hands trembling slightly but her movements firm. "I'm leaving," she said, her tone strangely calm. "Mia and I are leaving this place." Lorenzo stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. His heart hammered wildly in his chest as a fear he thought he had forgotten surged back like a rising tide. "Why?" he asked. "Because of the articles. I'll fix it. I'll sue them all. I'll make them take everything down and apologize publicly." Scarlett stopped. She finally turned to look at him. Her green eyes were red and swollen from crying all night, but her gaze was frighteningly resolute. "You don't understand," she said slowly. "This isn't just about the articles. This is about everything. I'm your burden, Lorenzo. I've always been your burden. Your enemies want to kill your daughter because of me. Your mother hates you because of me. The whole world is mocking you because of me. I'm your weakness. And in your world, weakness means death. You're not a burden," Lorenzo shot back, stepping closer. "I am," Scarlett cut in, her voice rising. "Look outside. Dozens of reporters are surrounding your house. Your business partners are questioning you. Your men are whispering behind your back. All because of me. Because of the bread-stealing whore. Because of the social climbing fraud. I can't let you lose everything because of me." Scarlett turned back to her suitcase, but Lorenzo moved to block her path. He stood there, tall and imposing, yet his gray eyes were filled with a despair she had never seen before, like a man watching his world collapse. "Do you really think I care about any of that?" Lorenzo asked, his voice trembling in a way Scarlett had never heard. "Do you think I care about business partners, public opinion, or what anyone thinks of me?" "I know you don't," Scarlett replied, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But I do. I don't want to be the reason you lose everything. I don't want Mia to grow up knowing her mother is the one who dragged her father into the mud." Lorenzo grabbed Scarlett by the shoulders and forced her to look at him. His gray eyes burned with an intensity she had never seen before. "Listen to me," Lorenzo said, his voice low and raw with sincerity. "Before I met you, I had everything. Money, power, the fear of an entire city. But I had nothing. I lived in a mansion worth tens of millions, and no one waited for me to come home. I had hundreds of loyal men, but not a single person who truly cared whether I lived or died. I was the most powerful mafia boss in Seattle, and I was so lonely I couldn't sleep at night." Lorenzo loosened his grip, lifting a hand to gently cup her tear-streaked face. "Then you appeared," he continued more softly. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't know how much money I had. You didn't know how many people I could kill. You only saw a lonely man sitting in a bar at midnight, and you smiled at him. You loved me when I had nothing to offer but lies. You're the only person in my life who ever loved me for who I am, not for my power or my money." Scarlett broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, her thin shoulders shaking. Lorenzo pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if she might vanish if he let go. "I can lose everything," Lorenzo whispered into her hair. "The empire, the money, the power, but I can't lose you. I can't lose you again. You and Mia are everything I have. Everything I want. Please don't go." Scarlett didn't answer. She just stood there in his arms, crying until there were no tears left. And for the first time since returning to the Russo estate, she allowed herself to believe that maybe she belonged here, maybe she belonged beside this man. Even if he was a monster, even if his world was soaked in blood and violence, even if the entire world was judging her, because he loved her. And she, no matter how much she tried to deny it, still loved him. Victor Castellano had been waiting for this opportunity for weeks. When the media storm exploded around the Russo estate, when Lorenzo was consumed with managing public opinion and cleaning up the scandal his own mother had unleashed, when the entire city's attention was fixed on the private life of the mafia boss, Victor knew this was the perfect moment to strike. He had quietly planted his people among the reporters camped outside the mansion. He had bribed one of the household staff to obtain the internal security layout. He had tracked Lorenzo's schedule for 2 weeks, and knew that every Wednesday afternoon, the Russo boss left the estate to meet with allied gang leaders. That Wednesday, when Lorenzo had been gone for 15 minutes, the attack began. A delivery truck slammed straight into the main gate, blowing apart the security system. At the same time, 12 assassins dressed in black poured in from 3 different directions, silenced weapons cutting down Russo's guards with ruthless precision. Within 5 minutes, 18 of Lorenzo's most elite bodyguards lay motionless on the manicured lawn, blood soaking into the white roses of the garden. Scarlett was feeding Mia in the nursery when she heard the gunfire. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew instantly what was happening. She scooped up her daughter and ran toward the back door where Lorenzo had shown her the emergency exit. But she hadn't taken 10 steps before 3 dark figures appeared and blocked her path. "Don't make this hard on us," one of them said, his voice cold as ice. "The boss only wants you and the baby. Don't resist, and you live. Resist, and you die." Scarlett backed away, clutching Mia, who screamed in her arms. She searched desperately for something to defend herself, but there was nothing. Just her bare hands and a 4-month-old baby who needed protection. She didn't stand a chance. As the assassin moved closer, Scarlett did the only thing she could. She turned her back, shielding Mia with her own body, and closed her eyes to wait. "Don't hurt my child," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "Do whatever you want to me, but don't touch my baby." A brutal blow to the back of her head sent Scarlett collapsing to the floor. She still held Mia tightly as she lost consciousness, a mother's instinct refusing to let go even as darkness swallowed her. When Lorenzo received Enzo's call that the estate was under attack, he was in a meeting with 5 of Seattle's most powerful gang leaders. His face drained of color in an instant. He leapt to his feet, overturning the conference table with a thunderous crash, and stormed out like a mad beast. On the drive back, Lorenzo called Scarlett dozens of times with no answer. He called the guards with no response. He called the staff and heard nothing. When the Maybach roared through the shattered gates of the estate, Lorenzo saw hell. Bodies of guards everywhere, blood staining the garden, the front doors smashed in. Inside, the mansion that had once echoed with his daughter's laughter was silent like a graveyard. Lorenzo ran to the nursery and kicked the door open. The crib was empty. No Mia, no Scarlett. Only a fallen bottle on the floor and a few dried smears of blood on the wall. Lorenzo collapsed, his hands clawing at the wooden floor until his fingers bled. A raw, anguished roar tore from his throat and echoed through the empty mansion. It wasn't the roar of a Mafia boss. It was the scream of a father who had just lost everything. Lorenzo's phone vibrated. An unknown number. He answered with trembling hands. "Russo." Victor Castellano's voice purred with delight. "Long time no see. I have a gift for you." Mia's cries rang through the phone, mixed with Scarlett's screams, calling her daughter's name. Lorenzo felt as if his heart had been ripped from his chest. "Castellano," Lorenzo said, his voice icy but shaking with restrained madness. "If you touch a single hair on them, I'll wipe out your entire bloodline down to the last child." Victor laughed loudly. "You're not in a position to threaten me, Russo. I have your daughter. I have your woman. You want them alive? You give me all Western territory. You have 24 hours. The call ended. Lorenzo sat alone in the empty nursery, gray eyes hollow and staring into nothingness. He didn't know what to do. For the first time in his life, the most powerful Mafia boss in Seattle was completely trapped. Then the last person he ever expected appeared. Valentina Russo stood in the doorway of the nursery, her face pale, eyes red as if she'd cried the entire way. "I know where Castellano is holding them," Valentina said, her voice trembling. "I have someone inside his organization. I'll give you the address." Lorenzo stared at his mother, his eyes filled with suspicion and rage. "Why are you helping me? Why now?" Valentina stepped forward and fell to her knees before her son. Tears streamed down her lined face. "Because she's my granddaughter," she said, her voice breaking. "I was wrong. I hurt you and Scarlett because of my pride, but I can't let my granddaughter die in the hands of our enemy. Please forgive me. Save my granddaughter." Lorenzo looked at her for a long moment, then stood up. "Give me the address," he said coldly. "What's between you and me can wait. Right now I'm going to save my family." Scarlett woke up in a dark, damp, abandoned warehouse. Her head felt as if it were being split open by a hammer, blood still seeping from the wound at the back of her skull. But the first thing she thought of wasn't herself. Mia. Where was her daughter? She tried to sit up and realized her hands were tightly bound to a rusted iron pillar. She turned her head frantically, searching, and her heart shattered when she saw Mia lying inside an iron cage a few meters away. The baby was crying, her cries weak and hoarse, as if she'd been crying for so long she had no strength left. "My baby," Scarlett screamed, wrenching against the ropes until her wrists bled. Mia, Mommy's here. Don't be scared. A cold laugh echoed from the shadows. Victor Castellano stepped forward, a lit Cuban cigar glowing red between his lips, the long scar on his face twisting like a snake under the dim lights. He wore an elegant black suit, polished leather shoes, looking like a refined businessman if not for the black eyes that gleamed with the chill of a venomous predator. "Awake already," Victor said, drawing on his cigar and blowing smoke into Scarlett's face. "Good. I want you awake when I call Lorenzo. I want him to hear you scream." "What do you want from me?" Scarlett asked, forcing her voice to stay steady even as her heart raced in terror. "I don't want anything from you," Victor replied, walking toward the iron cage where Mia lay. "I want Lorenzo to suffer. I want him on his knees. I want him to lose everything, the way my father lost his son to his father's hands 20 years ago. And you, and that baby, are how I'll do it." Victor opened the cage and roughly lifted Mia. The baby screamed in fear and distress. Scarlett went wild, yanking at the ropes and screaming like a wounded animal. "Let my child go." "You bastard. Let my child go." Victor laughed, set Mia back into the cage, then stepped in front of Scarlett. He grabbed her chin, forcing her to meet his cold black eyes. "I like prey that fights back," he said, his voice sweet as honey and poisonous as venom. "It makes breaking them more fun." The first blow smashed into Scarlett's stomach, doubling her over as she retched in pain. The second hit her face, splitting her lip, blood spilling down her chin. The third, fourth, fifth followed like hail. Victor didn't use his fists. He used a short iron rod, each strike leaving deep bruises and cracking bones. Scarlett didn't scream. She bit her lip until it bled, tears streaming down her face, but she refused to give Victor the satisfaction of hearing her beg. She stared at Mia, at her daughter crying in the cage, and told herself she had to stay strong. For her child. She had to live for her child. After half an hour of torture, Victor stopped, breathing hard from exhaustion. Scarlett hung limply against the ropes, her face swollen and unrecognizable, blood dripping onto the concrete floor. But she was still breathing, still looking at her daughter with eyes full of love and defiance. Then an explosion tore through the front of the warehouse. The metal doors were blown apart by a grenade, smoke filling the air, and through the haze a figure stormed in like a demon from hell. Lorenzo Russo stood there, gun in hand, gray eyes blazing like twin infernos. Behind him, Enzo and 20 of his most elite men flooded in, weapons roaring through the night. The battle erupted. Bullets tore through the dark warehouse like rain. Victor's men were more numerous, but Lorenzo's were deadlier. One by one, Castellano's assassins fell, blood spreading across the concrete. Lorenzo didn't take cover like the others. He charged straight toward Scarlett and Mia, shooting down anyone in his path without hesitation or thought. His body moved on instinct, forged by 20 years of fighting in the underworld. A bullet tore through his left shoulder. Lorenzo staggered but didn't fall. Another grazed his thigh. He kept moving, blood soaked his white shirt, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not while Scarlett hung bleeding from the ropes. Not while Mia cried in a cage like a trapped animal. Victor saw the tide turning and raised his gun, pressing it to Scarlett's head. "Stop!" Victor shouted, panic cracking his voice. "Stop or I'll shoot this bitch." Lorenzo stopped 10 steps away, gun still raised. His eyes met Scarlett's, and in that look she understood everything. She understood his plan without a word. "Drop your weapon," Victor ordered, finger tightening on the trigger. "Drop it and kneel." Lorenzo slowly lowered his gun as if obeying. And the instant Victor relaxed, thinking he'd won, Scarlett acted. She bit down hard on Victor's gun hand, teeth tearing through flesh to the bone. Victor screamed in agony, the gun falling to the floor. Lorenzo lunged like a panther, smashing his fist into his enemy's face with all the rage and hatred of 20 years. Victor crashed to the ground, blood spraying from his nose and mouth. Lorenzo didn't stop. He kept punching, each blow like a sledgehammer, obliterating the face of the man who had dared touch his family. Only when Enzo dragged him away did Lorenzo stop. Victor Castellano lay motionless on the floor, his face unrecognizable, still breathing. Lorenzo turned and cut Scarlett free. She collapsed into his arms, broken and wounded, but alive. "Mia," she whispered hoarsely. "Save her." Lorenzo nodded, gently set Scarlett down, then went to the cage. He tore it open, lifted his daughter, and crushed her to his chest. Mia stopped crying, her wide gray eyes looking up at her father as if she knew she was safe. And Lorenzo Russo, the blood-soaked Mafia boss of Seattle, wept like a child as he held his daughter in his arms. Lorenzo handed Mia to Enzo and signaled his right-hand man to get the baby to the car immediately. Enzo nodded, clutching the child tightly, and disappeared into the night with most of the men. Only Lorenzo, Scarlett, and Victor Castellano remained in the blood-soaked warehouse, Victor groaning weakly on the concrete floor. Lorenzo bent down, picked up Victor's gun, wiped the blood from the grip, then walked back to Scarlett. She was sitting against a rusted wall, her face swollen and unrecognizable, yet her green eyes still burned with an emotion he couldn't fully read. "Do you want to end him yourself?" Lorenzo asked, placing the gun into Scarlett's hands. "He tortured you. He locked our daughter in an iron cage like an animal. You have the right to decide his fate." Scarlett looked down at the gun, feeling the cold weight of the metal in her palm. She had never held a gun before. She had never imagined herself holding something meant to end a human life. But now, staring at Victor Castellano lying at her feet, the man who had kidnapped her daughter, tortured her, nearly killed them both, she felt a fire of rage rising in her chest. With Lorenzo's support, she stood and walked toward Victor. He looked up at her with swollen eyes and a blood-smeared face, forcing a mocking smile through broken teeth. "Do it," Victor rasped, blood spilling from the corner of his mouth. "Kill me. Prove you're just a monster like the rest of us." Scarlett raised the gun and aimed it at his forehead. Her hands shook, her finger resting on the trigger, just a small pressure away from ending everything. She thought of the blows, the pain, the sound of Mia screaming inside the cage, the terror of believing she would die without seeing her daughter again. She had every reason to pull the trigger. She had more than enough hatred to take his life. But then she lowered the gun. "No," Scarlett said, her voice strangely calm. "I won't kill you." Victor stared at her in disbelief mixed with contempt. "Coward. You don't have the nerve." "I'm not a coward," Scarlett replied, tossing the gun aside. "I just don't want to become you. I don't want my daughter to grow up with a mother who kills. You're not worth my hands being stained with blood. You're not worth me losing myself." She turned to Lorenzo, her green eyes meeting his gray ones under the dim warehouse lights. "As for you," she said softly, "what you do with him is up to you. That's your world. Those are your rules, but I don't belong to that world. I'm just a poor painter who wants to raise her daughter to be a good person." Lorenzo looked at Scarlett for a long moment, then stepped forward and wrapped her in his arms with all the gentleness a Mafia boss could manage. He didn't care about Victor groaning on the floor. He didn't care about the blood pouring from his shoulder and thigh. He cared only about the woman in his arms, the woman who had survived hell and still refused to become a demon. "I thought I'd lost you," Lorenzo whispered into her hair, his voice breaking like a frightened child. "I thought I'd lost both you and Mia. I didn't know how I'd go on if I did." Scarlett felt his body trembling and realized he was crying. The most ruthless Mafia boss in Seattle was sobbing in her arms like a terrified boy. She wrapped her arms around him despite the pain in her battered body, despite her swollen face, and held him tightly. "We're still here," she whispered. "Mia and I are still here. You saved us." Lorenzo tightened his grip as if afraid she would vanish if he let go. "I love you," he said, speaking the words for the first time since they had reunited. "I love you, Scarlett. I'm sorry I didn't say it sooner. I'm sorry for everything you've suffered." Scarlett lifted her head, her green eyes filled with tears yet warmer than ever. "I love you too," she replied, her voice trembling. "I've always loved you. Even if you're a monster, even if your world is terrifying, I still love you." They stood there in the blood-soaked warehouse, holding each other amid bodies and the enemy's groans. Yet to them it was the most beautiful moment in the world, because they were still alive, because they still had each other, and because for the first time after so much pain, they finally admitted their love. 1 month passed after the night of horror in the warehouse. Lorenzo spent 2 weeks in the hospital for the gunshot wounds to his shoulder and thigh, but he recovered quickly thanks to his strong physique and an iron will to return to his family. Scarlett was also badly injured after Victor's torture. 2 broken ribs and bruises covering her body, yet she refused to stay in the hospital. She wanted to be with Mia. She wanted to be with Lorenzo. She had run away enough. Victor Castellano was handed over by Lorenzo to the police, along with evidence of dozens of murders and smuggling operations over the past 20 years. The Mafia boss, who had once been the terror of Seattle, now faced life in prison without parole. Lorenzo didn't kill Victor, not out of mercy, but because he wanted his enemy to live and watch the Castellano empire collapse day by day. Death would have been too easy for a man like Victor. Living in shame and helplessness was the punishment he deserved. The Russo mansion was repaired and its security tripled. Lorenzo hired a new team of guards, installed the most advanced camera systems available, and built a reinforced underground safe room beneath the basement for emergencies. He swore he wouldn't let anyone touch his family ever again. One afternoon, while Lorenzo was in his office handling paperwork, Enzo announced a visitor. Valentina Russo stood at the door, holding a small red velvet box, her face visibly older than the last time they had seen each other. Lorenzo was ready to send his mother away, but she spoke first. "I'm not here to see you. I'm here to see Scarlett." Lorenzo hesitated, then nodded in consent. He led his mother to the art studio he had built for Scarlett in the east wing of the mansion. The room was filled with natural light from large glass panels, easels, and paints scattered everywhere, the faint scent of oil paint lingering in the air. Scarlett was sitting before an unfinished canvas, with Mia resting in a portable crib beside her. When Valentina entered, Scarlett stood up immediately, her body tense. Lorenzo stayed right beside her like a fortress, ready to protect her if his mother showed the slightest hostility. But Valentina didn't come to fight. She stepped forward and slowly knelt down in front of Scarlett. Both Scarlett and Lorenzo froze. Valentina Russo, the most arrogant woman in Seattle, was kneeling before the poor painter she had once despised. "I'm sorry," Valentina said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I was wrong. I drove you away when you were pregnant. I let my granddaughter live in hunger. I spread a scandal to destroy you. I was a terrible mother-in-law and a cruel grandmother. You have every right to hate me. You have every right to never forgive me. But I still wanted to say I'm sorry, even if it's too late." Scarlett looked down at the woman kneeling at her feet and remembered all the suffering Valentina had caused. A year of hell. Nearly dying during childbirth, raising her child in a slum, being humiliated in front of servants, being judged by the entire world because of a scandal. She had every right to hate. She had every right to refuse forgiveness. But when she looked into Valentina's eyes, she no longer saw arrogance or contempt. She saw an old woman who was lonely and full of regret. "Please stand up," Scarlett said gently, bending down to help Valentina to her feet. "I can't forget what happened, but I can learn to forgive. For Mia, for Lorenzo, and for myself. I don't want to live with hatred in my heart for the rest of my life." Valentina cried, the first time Scarlett had ever seen her cry. She placed the red velvet box into Scarlett's hands. "This was my mother-in-law's wedding ring," she said. "She wore it for 50 years beside Lorenzo's grandfather. I want you to have it. You deserve to be welcomed into the Russo family." Scarlett opened the box to reveal a classic diamond ring sparkling softly. She looked up at Lorenzo and saw an expression in his eyes she had never seen before. 1 month later, after Valentina had left and Mia was sleeping peacefully, Lorenzo led Scarlett back to the studio. The room was illuminated by hundreds of candles, red roses scattered across the floor, and in the center Lorenzo was down on one knee holding a diamond ring. Scarlett burst into tears. "I know I'm a monster," Lorenzo said, his voice shaking. "I have a blood-stained past. I have enemies everywhere. I don't deserve you, but I love you. I love you more than my own life, and I want to spend the rest of my life making it up to you, protecting you, and making you happy. Scarlett Hayes, will you marry me?" Scarlett knelt in front of him, reached out to gently touch the scar on his cheek, then kissed him under the flickering candlelight. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "I will." The wedding of Lorenzo Russo and Scarlett Hayes took place on a spring afternoon in the garden of the Russo estate. Small and intimate, just like their love. There were no hundreds of guests like at other elite weddings. There was only Enzo as best man, his arm still wrapped in bandages from the warehouse battle. There was Valentina seated in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son place the ring on the bride's finger. There were only a few close friends and the most loyal men who had followed Lorenzo through 20 years of hardship. And most importantly, there was Mia, the smallest flower girl in the world, held in grandmother Valentina's arms, her big gray eyes wide with wonder as she watched her parents share their first kiss as husband and wife. Scarlett wore a simple white wedding dress, not the $1 million diamond gown Lorenzo had wanted to buy for her. She chose an elegant lace dress she designed herself, because she wanted this wedding to belong to them, not to be a display of wealth. Lorenzo spoke his vows with a trembling voice, something no one in Seattle's underworld believed was possible. The most ruthless mafia boss in the city stood before a poor painter and promised to love her until his final breath, to protect her from every shadow, to become a man worthy of her love. "You taught me that true strength isn't killing your enemies," Lorenzo said, his voice breaking. "True strength is protecting the people you love. It's becoming better every day for them. It's choosing love over hatred. You saved me, Scarlett. You saved my soul." 3 years later, The Russo estate was filled with children's laughter. Mia was 3.5, a mischievous little girl with her mother's auburn hair and her father's gray eyes. She ran through the garden on tiny legs, laughing as grandmother Valentina chased after her with a box of candy in hand. Valentina had changed completely. She was no longer the cold and arrogant woman she once was. She was a grandmother who adored her grandchild so much that Lorenzo often had to remind her not to give Mia too many sweets. She moved into the guest house next to the main villa to be close to her granddaughter every day, and her relationship with Scarlett warmed steadily, like spring sunlight melting ice. And the Russo family gained another member. Matteo Russo, 1-year-old, was the perfect copy of Lorenzo with black hair and sharp gray eyes, even though he was only crawling. He was the new joy of the family, cherished and protected by his big sister Mia like a treasure. Lorenzo still led the Russo empire, but he gradually transitioned it into legitimate businesses. Chains of hospitals, hotels, and real estate brought profits no less than the old underground dealings. And more importantly, he could hold his head high in front of his children without shame for what he did. He was still dangerous, still had enemies, but he was no longer a blood-soaked monster. He was a father, a husband, a man trying to become better every day. Scarlett became a renowned painter with her work exhibited across the United States. Her most famous painting was titled Redemption, depicting a pair of blood-stained hands holding a tiny child's hand. Lorenzo bought the painting for a record price and hung it in his office, so every day he'd be reminded of the reason he changed. One late night, after the children were asleep and the mansion was wrapped in silence, Lorenzo and Scarlett sat on the balcony overlooking the glowing lights of Seattle. "Do you ever regret it?" Lorenzo asked, holding his wife's hand tightly. "Choosing to be with someone like me?" Scarlett turned to him, her green eyes shimmering in the moonlight. "No," she said. "I don't regret a single second. Even if you were a monster, even if your world was once terrifying, you changed for me and for our children. You became a better man, and I love the man you've become more than the man you once were." Lorenzo pulled her into his arms, holding her as if afraid she'd disappear. "I love you," he whispered. "Forever." "I love you too," Scarlett replied. "Forever." They sat there in the night, two hearts once broken now fused into one, looking toward the future with faith and hope, because love isn't about finding a perfect person. Love is about finding someone willing to become better because of you. And Lorenzo Russo, once the most notoriously brutal mafia boss in Seattle, spent the rest of his life proving that truth. Every day, every hour, every heartbeat. The story of Lorenzo and Scarlett is proof that no one is born a monster, and no one has to remain a monster forever. People can change when they find a reason worthy enough to change. Love has the power to redeem lost souls. Forgiveness can heal wounds that seem impossible to mend. And sometimes, happiness comes from the places we least expect. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share the video so we can bring you more stories every day. How did you feel about Lorenzo and Scarlett's story? Do you believe someone can truly change completely for love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd truly love to hear what's in your heart. Thank you for watching until the very end. Wishing all of you good health, a joyful life, a happy family, and peace in every single day. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.